Finally, the Big 12 has released their 2025 football schedule. First thing I saw was that Baylor's not playing Tech this year, but there's a lot of things, including non-conference conference games. Craig Smoak joins us, and Paul Catalina. I'm David Smoak, 365 Sports in New Orleans. Craig, thank you for being a part of it. We miss you, but what was your reaction when you kind of started to sift through what the schedule was like for this year?
I haven't had an ability to really look through it all that in depth. I've been out running a lot of errands, but I guess my first reaction was just glad that it was able to get put out there, and Mac Rhodes delivered on his promise that it would be within the week, and it was. And so thanks to him for joining us and giving us that insight and getting people kind of revved up and prepared for this drop. And so they delivered as they promised, and now everybody can get to their being and moaning about it, which I've already seen a good bit of. I guess one of the first things I saw is, man, BYU's got a large fan base, and makes them very attractive in so many ways. But the problem with having a large fan base sometimes is when things aren't great, like we saw a couple of times during the season, of just how loud that can get in comparison to others. And so with their very large fan base, they're excited about next year. But I looked through every single Big 12 team's Big 12 release at one point just to see what the immediate reactions were. And the only one that had more than like a couple of people was BYU's schedule, and it had like 13 replies in the first 5 minutes, and they were all complaining about why Holy War isn't on Rivalry Week. And then you get to look in, and TCU Baylor's not on Rivalry Week. And really the only rivalry that's on Rivalry Week is Arizona and Arizona State. And so that's one of the things that jumped out immediately to me, was just seeing kind of the BYU reaction to that, and then realizing, well, it's not just the Holy War, which would make sense to be on Rivalry Week, you would think. Instead, it's in whatever, like October something. But, TCU Baylor's not on that week, and whatever else you want to throw in there, everything but Arizona State. So that jumped out just because there was so much attention and reaction to that immediately. I know we'll get into Baylor. I don't like that. And we knew all this. We knew this going in. We knew they weren't playing Tech. Like, we already knew that part of it. But
right.
I don't think it's good that the Texas teams aren't all playing each other. I think that's a grave miscalculation. I don't think that makes any sense. And I think every schedule that you see for a Texas team that doesn't include all three, it feels a little bit lacking in comparison. You get to play maybe a good team. Maybe you get Colorado on your schedule, or you get BYU instead of playing that third Texas team. But I just think for fan interest and also for great games, to have those four Texas teams not all round robining each other for whatever reason, that the calculations of the formula they use, that's another thing that just feels like there's something missing there, that all three or all four of those teams should play round robin. So those are just a couple of like the immediate things that jumped off the page to me, is not seeing, for example, in the Texas, like no Tech and Baylor. Like, really? Like, y'all don't want to play that game every year? So that feels a little naked to not have Tech on the schedule. And I'm sure it feels weird for them to not see, Baylor and whatever other iterations of that throughout the league there are. But, those are a couple things very lacking in Rivalry Week outside of the Arizona showdown. And also just I don't like the lack of the Texas round robin. I think that's something that a lot of fans can wrap their arms around. And quite frankly, the last point here is I think it's, with so many teams, a little lackluster. In some cases, I just think it waters it down, and that's something we were kind of warned about. But I think you look at some of the schedules, and you, at first glance at least, you're like, okay, like that's pretty good, that's pretty cool. And I'm sure depending on what school you look at, you feel a little bit more strongly about it. But I don't want to see more teams added to this conference to water it down any further than it already is.
Craig, you mentioned the rivalry week, and as I go down it does. As it goes down, like that, you go down the list, they missed a ton of scheduling opportunities here. If you're going to compete in rivalry week with the SEC and the ACC and the Big Ten, they're all playing their big games then. So it's either them going, we're not going to win in the ratings that week anyway, let's try to find other weeks where we can put them, or it's them overthinking it like they have with the Texas teams, and they want to be in the same kind of schedule model. As long as everybody's not, waiting 9 years to play each other, I think having a couple of, 4 years between games isn't that awful.
Yeah, and I think with that, my first thoughts for why you wouldn't do that would be the TV networks just said like, hey, we've got bigger games on, or we got, like you won't have TV spots is the only thing I can think of. So you don't want to not have a TV spot for TCU Baylor, which I still find that hard to imagine. But there are so many games that week that maybe that's the reason why. But like, so you're the one conference of the major conferences that gets kind of screwed during this big rivalry week because either you didn't schedule it properly, because the formulas that you punched in or the computers came up with didn't take that week into consideration the way it should have been taken in, or the TV network said like, hey, you need to spread your rivalry games around to make sure they get TV time, which is a totally different conversation. But yeah, I mean, that's rivalry week, and you would not know it in the league outside of Arizona State. That's the only one. And, I think that's where I've seen a lot of the complaining as I mentioned at the top, is just sort of why is that so lacking? Because around the rest of the country it won't be. So I have to think it's either an issue with how they're doing it, or it's a TV thing.
Baylor with 7 home games. Most everybody will have 7 or 8. They have the buys, the 2 buys built into the schedule. I like the way they do that. And I'll tell you what, we're going to find out if that momentum carried over despite the loss to LSU with what they have. SMU, Auburn, SMU, you have Samford, and then you open up against the defending champions in Arizona State. That's a great start and could either give you a tremendous lift, or you got to be careful. You could be looking at 2-2, 1-3.
Yeah, you could be, but we could also be looking at a situation like last year where we're analyzing these schedules and not realizing that, like, hey,
Yep.
BYU might not be as good and Arizona's going to be great, and you know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
on paper, though, yeah, that's a really tough schedule, and I think in
reality,
that's going to be a really tough schedule right out of the gates for them. But you just never quite know, right? So maybe SMU's down, or maybe Arizona State's not quite as good. Maybe Hugh Freeze just runs Auburn right into the ground. But I do think on paper that's a terrific, or it's a terrific start for fan interest. It's also very dangerous if you're Dave Aranda and getting off to a start like you did this past year, and we know how that all kind of felt. So yeah, you're looking into the jaws of some pretty big opponents right out of the gates. But if you navigate it well, then I think you feel incredible about what you have the rest of the way, because again, on paper, that first half of the schedule looks pretty brutal. I mean, Auburn, just in fact, being an SEC team, and they should be pretty good. They got new quarterback in Jackson Arnold. I mean, Hugh Freeze at this point's gotta be hitting the stride. SMU on the road ought to be tough. Arizona State at home, and then you close out September in Stillwater, and we don't know what Oklahoma State's going to look like. But then you get past that K-State game and you get to that first bye week, or that idle week as they're referring to it, in October. And I think you look at the rest of that schedule, and on paper, again, not knowing how good these teams are going to be, you feel great about the second half. So we'll see when we finally arrive there. But, yeah, the first half's definitely the tougher of the two. And technically, I guess there's thirds. But if you do break it up into two, that first half looks daunting. That second half, not so much.
Yeah, Craig, for Baylor, And I don't think that this is going to be a team that's going to put all their eggs in the Auburn basket. But if they do get that Auburn win going into SMU, I think will feel a lot easier than it would if you're 0-1 and playing a team that was in the playoff that has a ton of people back. Auburn to me could be the early swing part of the schedule. When it comes down to that, because then Arizona State and K-State before the bye as well. You could really find yourself behind an 8 ball, or you could find yourself feeling really good if you start winning those games.
I mean, realistically, you could be like 1-5. Mm-hmm. You could also, like you said, win those games and be in good shape. I mean, that's going to be, I think the tale of the season is how those first few weeks go, not unlike it sort of felt this year, although it turns out the start didn't really matter as much in the end. I mean, it did in terms of you not getting to a title game. In terms of not playing for the Big 12, those early games mattered, but it didn't totally disrupt your season. But I think this is similar, if not far more difficult, because you're adding Auburn in the mix in replace of what would have been, I guess, Utah last year, but you're traveling to SMU. That's definitely a bigger game than you had last year in the non-con. As far as a second game goes, Samford's obviously the guaranteed win on here, but yeah, I mean, the defending Big 12 champs 3 of those first 4 games are brutal, and then again you go to Stillwater. Like, who the hell knows with them? And you get K-State. I mean, you didn't play them last year, but they ought to be pretty good again. And so yeah, that first 6-week stretch. I mean, you could say anywhere from 6-0, and they're probably ranked in the top 10. Or they could be like 1-5, and we're talking about Dave Aranda's job again. But most likely they'll be somewhere in the middle, and wherever they are, it will be interesting because that first half does look like it's going to be pretty juicy in terms of storylines and big matchups.
We don't know in the Big 12. You just don't know. If you would have had Arizona State early last year, you'd have thought that's a pretty good deal, and you'd have Baylor in 21, whatever, TCU in 22. So you're right. Yeah, it's I know I guess I just kind of blew by the fact that Tech and Baylor weren't going to play. I just kind of erased that. But I did notice that, and even though I should have remembered that. But, yeah, I just that rivalry, that series, and, yeah, they got to kind of figure it out for everybody. There's 16 teams, but I wish that they could continue to play TCU, Houston, and Tech every year, and maybe they'll eventually be able to kind of tweak that along the way. Craig Smoak with us. The Big 12 football schedule released earlier today. Now we can look at it, jot down what travel schedule you have and what home games you can attend, all of that. And at least it's out now. And now everybody has gotten theirs out with them being the last of the major conferences. This is 365 Sports.